There is a logbook sitting in a locked drawer in my kitchen. Black leather cover, spiral bound, the kind you can buy at any gas station for $3. There are 11 years of entries in that book. Dates, times, mile markers, weather conditions, witness descriptions when I had them. 2,109 individual sightings, all logged in my own handwriting, all recorded along the same 47-mile stretch of State Route 132 in Wexford County, Michigan. I was a state trooper for 22 years. I logged those sightings the same way I logged accident reports and DUI stops, with discipline, with specificity, with the understanding that documentation is the difference between something that happened and something someone claims happened. I documented every single one. And I need you to understand that, because what I'm about to tell you will sound like the ravings of a man who has lost his mind. I have not lost my mind. I lost something far worse. I lost myself, not in the metaphorical way people say when they're going through a divorce or a career change. I mean, I lost the boundary between what I was and what they were. I mean, I spent 11 years watching them from the shoulder of a highway, and somewhere in those 11 years, the distance between observer and observed collapsed entirely. They didn't come to me. I went to them, and I never fully came back. My name is Dale Kowalski. I'm 67 years old, and I served with the Michigan State Police from 1981 to 2003. Retired at the rank of sergeant. Before that, I did 2 tours with the Army, came home in 1979 with a busted knee and a marriage that lasted exactly 14 months after my return. I don't say any of that to earn sympathy. I say it so you understand I am not the kind of man who believes in fairy tales. I spent my professional life dealing in evidence, in testimony, in the cold mechanics of what can be proven. What I cannot prove, and what I will tell you anyway, is that there are things living in the forests along State Route 132 that are not wolves, not bears, not any animal in any field guide I have ever seen. They walk upright. They are intelligent. And 2 of them, for a period of nearly 6 years, knew my name. I should tell you right now, this doesn't end the way you want it to. If you're hoping for a happy resolution, for some moment where I ride off into the sunset having cracked the case, close this video. I'm telling you this because I am running out of time to tell anyone, and because I made a promise to something that probably couldn't understand what a promise means. Or maybe it could. That's the part that still keeps me up at night. Now, I know how this works. I know you've got your finger hovering over that skip button, and I know the algorithm gods, or whatever they call them, need me to keep you interested. So, let me give you the short version first, and then I'll give you the real one. The short version is, I found 2 of them. I watched them grow. I fed them through 3 winters. One of them saved my life. The other one tried to end it, and by the time it was over, I wasn't sure which one had done me the bigger favor. If that's enough to keep you here, then settle in. This is going to take a while. It started in October of 1992. I was working the night shift on 132, which in those days was a nothing assignment. 47 miles of 2-lane blacktop cutting through state forest land between Cadillac and Mesick. Deer crossings, the occasional drunk driver, teenagers parking where they shouldn't. That was the job. I liked it because it was quiet, and because the quiet was the only thing that had ever made sense to me after the Army. My patrol car was the only vehicle on that road most nights after 11. Just me, the radio, and about 400,000 acres of second-growth hardwood on either side. The first sighting wasn't mine. It was a call that came in at 11:47 p.m. on October 14th. A woman named Linda Hargrove, driving home from her sister's place in Harrietta, reported that something had crossed the road in front of her car approximately 2 miles south of the Hodenpil Dam. She described it as and I wrote this down verbatim. A very large dog walking on its back legs like a person. She estimated it was 6.5 to 7 feet tall. She said it moved across the road in 3 strides and disappeared into the tree line on the east side. She was not intoxicated. She was not hysterical. She was a 53-year-old retired schoolteacher, and she was certain of what she had seen. I responded to the call, drove out to the location, found nothing. No tracks, no fur, no scat. The shoulder was gravel, and the tree line started about 15 feet from the road. I shone my spotlight into the woods and saw nothing but birch and tag alder. I wrote it up as an animal crossing, species unknown, and filed it. That should have been the end of it. 3 weeks later, almost to the day, I got another call. Different driver, same stretch of road. Male, 41, commercial trucker. Something large and bipedal had crossed in front of his rig near mile marker 27. He described it as canine in the face but human in the body. He was shaking when I arrived. Not a man who shook easily, judging by the size of him. By December, I had 4 reports. By the following March, 11. All within a 7-mile corridor between mile markers 24 and 31. All at night. All describing the same thing. A large, bipedal, canine-appearing creature moving through or across the road. I logged every one. I told no one. I did not tell my supervisor. I did not tell the DNR. I did not tell my ex-wife, who by then was living in Grand Rapids with a dentist and wouldn't have believed me anyway. I kept the logbook in my patrol car, and I kept my mouth shut, because I knew with the certainty of a man who has spent 2 decades in law enforcement, that the moment I said these words out loud to another officer, my career was over. So I watched. That's what I did for the first 3 years. I watched and I logged, and I drove that stretch of highway every night with my windows cracked, listening. I started parking in pull-offs near the hot spots, killing my headlights sitting in the dark. I brought binoculars. I brought a camera, one of those early digital models that took pictures about as sharp as a wet newspaper, but it was what I had. I never got a usable photo, not once in 11 years. They were too fast, too aware, too smart. But I saw them. I saw them 14 times in those first 3 years with my own eyes, and each time I saw a little more. The first clear sighting was in January of 1994. Temperature was 6 below zero. I was parked in a pull-off near mile marker 26, engine off, wrapped in a sleeping bag I kept in the trunk. I had been sitting there for 4 hours, and I was about to leave when I saw movement at the tree line. Something emerged from the forest approximately 80 yards from my position. It was large. I estimated 7 feet at the shoulder when it stood fully upright, which it did for about 12 seconds before dropping to all fours and moving northeast along the tree line. It moved like nothing I had ever seen, fluid on 4 legs. But when it stood, the posture was disturbingly human. The head was broad, the snout pronounced, the ears tall and forward-facing. The eyes caught my parking lights. I had bumped them accidentally when reaching for my binoculars, and they reflected amber. Not green like a deer, not blue-white like a coyote. Amber like old honey held up to a flame. It looked at me. I am certain of this. It looked directly at my vehicle, and it paused, and then it continued on as if I were not worth the interruption. That pause, that dismissal, that was the moment I understood I was not dealing with an animal in any sense I had been trained to understand. An animal runs or it attacks. This thing assessed me and made a decision. By 1995, I was spending my days off on that highway. I had no social life to speak of. My apartment in Cadillac was a place to sleep and shower between shifts. The road was where I lived. I started leaving food, deer carcasses from roadkill, which I collected with gloves and dragged into the tree line near the hot spots. I told myself it was a research method. I told myself I was baiting for observation purposes. I was lying. I was trying to make contact. The carcasses disappeared, always overnight, always completely, bones and all. No drag marks, no scattered remains, just gone, as if the ground had opened and swallowed them. I started leaving the carcasses in specific patterns, 3 in a line or in a triangle formation, to see if the retrieval pattern changed. It did. When I left 3 in a line, they were taken in order from north to south. When I left them in a triangle, the center one was always taken first. There was logic to it. There was preference. In the spring of 1996, I found the den. I need to pause here and say something about what finding the den meant, because I think most people hear that and imagine a hole in the ground or a cave opening. That's not what this was. It was a structure. About a quarter-mile east of mile marker 28, set into a ravine where 2 seasonal creeks converge, there was a formation of deadfall timber that had been deliberately arranged. Not fallen naturally. Arranged. Logs stripped of bark and leaned against each other in a pattern that created an enclosed space roughly 10 feet wide and 6 feet tall at the peak. The floor was packed earth covered in dried grass and what I later identified as cattail fluff. There were bones inside, deer mostly, but also raccoon, porcupine, and something I could not identify that was too large to be any local mammal and too small to be a bear. I found it in daylight, and it was empty. I did not enter. I circled it at a distance of about 20 feet, documenting everything I could see. There were tracks in the soft earth near the creek, 5-toed prints, elongated with claw marks that extended nearly 2 inches beyond the toe pads. The stride length between tracks was over 4 feet. I measured everything, I photographed everything, and then I left, because every instinct I had was telling me that this was not a place I was supposed to be. I came back the next night, and the night after that, and every night for the next 2 weeks. On the 15th night, I saw them. There were 2. I had suspected this from the sighting reports. Some described a creature with a darker coat, some lighter, and the size estimates varied enough to suggest more than one individual. But seeing them together was different. Seeing them together was the moment the world I had understood for 50 years quietly ended and a new one began. They came from the north, moving through the trees with a silence that should have been impossible for animals of their size. The larger one was dark, deep brown, almost black in the moonlight, with a silver-gray saddle across the shoulders. It moved on all 4s, but its front limbs were too long, its shoulders too high, its gait more ape than wolf. The smaller one was lighter, a tawny gold that almost glowed in the filtered moonlight, and it moved with a different energy entirely. Where the dark one was deliberate, scanning, alert, the golden one was curious. It paused to investigate things. It picked up a branch and turned it over in its hands, not paws. I could see the articulation of the fingers even from 30 yards, and then discarded it. They entered the den together. I heard low vocalizations, not howls, not barks, but a kind of rolling, guttural murmur that rose and fell in patterns that sounded, God help me, like conversation. 2 distinct tones, one deep, resonant, vibrating in my chest, the other higher, almost musical, with a quality that reminded me of the sound a cello makes when the bow barely touches the string. I sat in those woods until dawn. They did not come out. When the first gray light touched the canopy, I retreated to my car and drove home. I did not sleep. I sat at my kitchen table and I wrote down everything. Every detail, every measurement, every sound. And at the bottom of the page, in handwriting I barely recognize now, because my hand was shaking so badly, I wrote 2 words. They're real. Year 1 of knowing the den's location was pure observation. I came 3 or 4 nights a week, always alone, always on foot after parking my car at a trailhead 2 miles away. I wore the same clothes every time, a set of old hunting coveralls that I hung outside between visits so they would lose my scent and take on the smell of the woods. I never used flashlights. I never carried a weapon. That second decision was instinctive and probably stupid, but something told me that bringing a gun would change the dynamic in a way I couldn't take back. I was not a threat. I needed them to know I was not a threat. By the fall of 1996, I was certain they knew I was there. The Golden One. I had started thinking of it as the Golden One, the way you name a stray cat before admitting you've adopted it, would sometimes turn in my direction and hold still for long seconds, nose working, ears rotating. It never approached, but it never fled either. The Dark One was different. The Dark One watched me the way I had watched suspects in interrogation rooms, with a flat, measuring attention that made the hair on my neck stand up. It knew I was there too, and it was deciding what I was. I named them in January of 1997. I know that sounds foolish. I know that any biologist would tell you that naming your research subjects is the first step toward compromising your objectivity. But I had passed the border of objectivity so far back I couldn't see it in the rearview mirror anymore, and names were the only way I could organize my observations of their individual behaviors. The Dark One I called Samael. It's a name from old Hebrew texts, the angel of death, the accuser, the one who walks the boundary between obedience and defiance. I chose it because the Dark One moved like judgment. Every step was measured. Every reaction was calibrated. It did not waste energy. It did not play. When it killed, and I watched it kill 3 times in that first year, it was efficient beyond anything I had seen in nature. A single lunge, jaws at the throat, and then stillness. No shaking, no frenzy, just the precise application of force and then patience while the life drained out. The Golden One I called Ezra. It means helper in Hebrew. I chose it because from the very beginning, even before we had any kind of relationship, the Golden One behaved as if it were helping me understand. It would do things in my line of sight that seemed almost performative, stretching, grooming, manipulating objects with those long, articulated fingers. Samael hid the things that made them extraordinary. Ezra displayed them. The breakthrough came in the spring of 1997, and it came because of a mistake. I was making my approach through the ravine on a night in late April when my foot went through a layer of rotted ice over a seasonal pool. I went down hard, twisted my ankle, and let out a sound, not a scream, but a sharp, involuntary bark of pain that echoed off the ravine walls. I froze. I had just announced my presence to 2 apex predators from approximately 40 yards. Every survival instinct told me to get up and move, but my ankle was already swelling and the pain was immediate and severe. I heard them before I saw them. That murmuring vocalization, faster now, higher in pitch, then movement in the brush. Samael appeared first, rising from behind a deadfall log like smoke taking shape. Full upright, 7 feet and change, head tilted slightly to the left, in what I would later learn was its listening posture. It stared at me. I stared back. 20 yards between us and nothing but open ground. Then Ezra came around from the other side, low, moving on all 4s, and did something that changed everything. It approached me. Not in a straight line, in a wide arc, circling, sniffing, never taking its eyes off me. When it got within about 10 feet, it stopped and sat back on its haunches. And it looked at my ankle. Not at me, at my ankle. At the specific point of injury, which was already swelling visibly above my boot. It looked at my ankle the way a doctor looks at a wound, with assessment, with directed attention. Then it vocalized. A short, low sound, almost a cough, directed at Samael. Samael did not move. Ezra repeated the sound, louder. Samael huffed, a sharp exhale through the nose, and turned away, disappearing back into the trees. Ezra stayed. It stayed within 10 feet of me for the next 40 minutes, while I slowly, painfully, got to my feet and began hobbling back toward my car. It followed me. At a distance, through the trees, but it followed me all the way to the trailhead. When I reached my car and turned around, I could see the gold of its coat in the tree line, 2 amber eyes catching the faint glow of the parking area's single light. I stood there, leaning on my car door, my ankle screaming, and I said out loud to an animal, like an idiot, "Thank you." The eyes blinked, then they were gone. After the ankle incident, the dynamic shifted in ways I hadn't anticipated and couldn't fully control. Ezra began appearing near the trailhead on nights when I arrived. Not waiting, exactly, more like happening to be in the area, the way a neighborhood dog just happens to be near its owner's car when they get home from work. It would emerge from the brush, watch me begin my walk, and then parallel me through the forest at a distance of 20 to 30 yards. By the summer of 1997, the distance had closed to 10. I began bringing food directly to the ravine. Not roadkill anymore. I bought whole chickens, pork shoulders, and once, on a foolish impulse, a 20-pound bag of dog food that Ezra sniffed and then pushed away from itself with one hand in a gesture so human in its contempt that I actually laughed. It wanted real meat. It wanted bones it could crack. The dog food sat untouched until rain turned it to mush, and the raccoons took it. Samael was slower to accept my presence. For months, it would withdraw whenever I appeared, melting into the forest with a silence that still amazes me when I think about it. An animal that size, I estimated Samael at close to 350 pounds, should not be able to move through dense underbrush without making a sound. But it did. It moved like water through a sieve, like it could choose which parts of the physical world applied to it. The only sign of Samael's presence on most nights was the depth of the silence. When Samael was nearby, everything else shut up. No owls, no frogs, no insects. The forest held its breath. But over time, Samael stopped leaving. It would withdraw to the far side of the ravine and watch from there. Still that flat, measuring stare, but no longer fleeing. By the fall of 1997, it would accept food that I placed on a flat rock near the den entrance, though it would only take the food after I had retreated to what I came to think of as the observation distance, about 30 yards. Ezra had no such reservations. By October, Ezra was taking food from within arm's reach of where I sat. I need to tell you about the sounds, because the sounds are the part that still haunts me. Ezra vocalized frequently, and with what I can only describe as emotional range. There was the low murmur I'd heard at the den, which seemed to be a resting sound, a comfort sound. There was the sharp cough that functioned as a command or a redirect. There was a rising, keening vocalization that Ezra produced during rainstorms. It would sit at the den entrance with its face tilted up and make this sound that I can only compare to singing. Not human singing, not animal howling. Something in between that hit a frequency I could feel in my teeth. And then there was the sound Ezra made when I arrived. A specific vocalization, 3 syllables, that it produced only when it saw me coming through the trees. Always the same 3 syllables. Always in the same tone. I told myself it was a general alarm call or a recognition sound, the way a dog barks when its owner comes home. I told myself that for years, but the truth I couldn't escape was that Ezra never made that exact sound for anything else. Not for Samael, not for deer, not for storms, only for me. 3 syllables every time, like a word it had invented for one specific thing in its world. The years between 1998 and 2001 were what I think of as the golden time, and I'm going to tell you about them in detail, because they are the reason I am making this recording. They are the reason any of this mattered. Without those years, this is just a monster story. With them, it's something else entirely. Something I still don't have a word for. By 1998, I had retired from the state police. I told them it was the knee, the Army knee, which had never fully healed and which gave me genuine trouble on cold nights. That was partially true. The fuller truth was that I could not continue to serve as a law enforcement officer while harboring a secret that would have required me, by any reasonable interpretation of public safety protocols, to report the presence of unidentified predatory animals in a state forest. I chose the animals over the badge. I chose them without hesitation, and that should have been my first warning about what was happening to me. I bought a small property, 12 acres with a cabin that needed more work than it was worth, about 6 miles from the ravine, close enough to visit nightly, far enough that I wasn't leading trouble to my door. I lived on my pension, which wasn't much, and on odd jobs, firewood cutting, small engine repair, the kinds of things a man with my skill set could do without needing to explain himself to an employer. I didn't need much. I had never needed much. That's the thing about loneliness that people who haven't lived it don't understand. It makes you efficient. You learn exactly how little you need to survive. But I wasn't lonely anymore. That's the part I have to be honest about. For the first time since my marriage ended, for the first time since the Army, I had something in my life that needed me. Ezra needed me. Not for survival, it was a perfectly capable predator. But it had chosen me as part of its world, and the consistency of that choice, the nightly greeting, the proximity, the vocalization that was only for me. It filled something in my chest that had been hollow for 20 years. Ezra's intelligence continued to reveal itself in ways that kept me scribbling in that logbook until my hand cramped. It collected things, smooth stones from the creek, arranged in a line outside the den entrance. Pieces of broken glass, amber, green, blue, laid out in a pattern that I swear changed every few weeks. Once, a hubcap from the highway carried a quarter-mile through dense forest and placed precisely in the center of the stone line. These weren't random accumulations. They were displays. They were art, or something so close to art that the distinction doesn't matter. Samael's intelligence was different. Where Ezra created, Samael controlled. I watched it manage Ezra the way a senior officer manages a junior one, with posture, with proximity, with brief vocalizations that carried the weight of absolute authority. When Samael decided they were moving, they moved. When Samael decided they were sleeping, they slept. There was one exception to this hierarchy, and it was me. When I was present, Ezra deferred to its own instincts rather than Samael's direction. This caused tension. I could see it in the way Samael watched our interactions. That flat stare sharpening into something harder, something with an edge. Looking back, I can see that this was the first crack, but at the time I told myself it was normal. 2 animals adjusting to a new variable, nothing more. By 1999, Ezra would sit beside me, not touching, but close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from its body. These things run hot, much hotter than any canid should. On cold nights, sitting near Ezra was like sitting near a wood stove. Its breathing was deep and rhythmic, and on calm nights in the ravine, I would close my eyes and listen to it, and feel a peace I had not felt since I was a child sleeping in my parents' house, back when the world was small and safe, and the monsters were only in stories. I talked to it. I know how that sounds, but I talked to it the way you talk to a dog. except a dog doesn't tilt its head and narrow its eyes and adjust its posture in response to changes in your tone. I told Ezra about the army, about my ex-wife, about the nights on 132 before I knew what I was looking for. I told it about my father, who drank too much and loved too little, and died alone in a VA hospital in 1988 while I was on patrol, and didn't get the call until my shift ended. I told Ezra things I had never told another living being, and it listened with an attention so focused and so patient that I would sometimes forget, for whole minutes at a time, that I was not talking to a person. Samael tolerated this. That's the word. Tolerated. It would lie at the far end of the den clearing, facing away, but its ears would be rotated back toward us, tracking every sound. Occasionally, it would produce a low rumble, not quite a growl, not quite a purr, that I interpreted as displeasure. Ezra would sometimes respond with a soft vocalization that seemed to soothe the tension, like a wife reassuring a jealous husband. It's ridiculous to describe it in those terms. It's also the most accurate description I have. During the good years, I observed behaviors that no wildlife biologist would believe, and that I have never shared with another person until now. I watched Ezra use a stick to dig grubs from a rotting log, selecting the stick for length and diameter and sharpening the end against a rock before using it. I watched Samael carry a deer carcass 300 yards to a specific location and cache it under a deliberate pile of leaves and branches, not scattered, but woven, interlocked, designed to shed rain. I found, in the creek bed near the den, a series of marks on a flat stone that I cannot interpret as anything other than deliberate scratching. 3 vertical lines crossed by a diagonal, repeated 4 times. Not random, not claw sharpening, something else. The food I brought became a routine. 3 nights a week I would arrive with 20 to 30 pounds of raw meat, purchased in bulk from a butcher in Manton who thought I was running a dog rescue, which I suppose is not entirely inaccurate. I would place it on the flat rock. Ezra would approach while I was still near. Samael would wait until I withdrew. Over the years, the amount they consumed suggested to me that I was not their primary food source, just a supplement. They were still hunting. I would find deer kills within a half-mile radius of the den, always at night, always clean. There were other signs during those years, signs that I logged but did not fully understand until later. Sounds at the edges of the forest that didn't match either Samael or Ezra, a deeper vocalization, farther away, that I heard on 7 separate occasions between 1999 and 2001. Tracks near the highway that were too large for either of my 2, prints that measured 19 inches from heel to toe, compared to Ezra's 14 and Samael's 16. Trees with bark stripped at heights of 9 to 10 feet. Something was out there beyond what I knew. Something bigger. Something I chose not to think about because thinking about it would have meant admitting that the situation was larger than me. Larger than the ravine. Larger than the story I had built around 2 creatures and 1 retired trooper with too much time and too much need. I should have thought about it. I should have followed those tracks and those sounds and asked the obvious question. Where did Samael and Ezra come from? And were there others? But I didn't, because asking that question might have led to answers that threatened the only thing in my life that gave it meaning. So I stayed in the ravine, and I watched, and I loved them. Yes, I loved them, and I let the rest of the forest keep its secrets. The cracks started in the fall of 2001. Looking back, I can trace the exact sequence, and I can see how each one was a warning I chose to rationalize away. The first was behavioral. Samael, who had always been territorial but controlled, began marking the perimeter of the ravine more aggressively. Not just scent marking, physical marking. deep gouges in tree bark at the boundaries of what I came to think of as their territory. 3 parallel lines, driven deep enough into the wood to expose the white inner layer, at a height of about 6.5 feet. These marks appeared over the course of a single week in September, dozens of them, forming a rough perimeter around the ravine and extending south toward the highway. The second crack was relational. Samael began challenging Ezra more frequently. Vocalizations that had been murmurs became snarls. Postures that had been neutral became dominant, standing fully upright when Ezra was near me, blocking sight lines, inserting itself physically between us. Twice I saw Samael strike Ezra, open-handed blows to the shoulder that sent the smaller creature staggering. Ezra did not fight back. It submitted. It rolled, it averted its eyes. It produced a high-pitched keening that I felt in my sternum. But each time, after the display of dominance, Ezra would return to my side within the hour. And each time, Samael's stare when it watched this return was darker than before. The third crack was the kills. Samael had always been an efficient hunter, clean, precise, purposeful. But in the winter of 2001 into 2002, the kills changed. I found a deer near the highway that had been killed but not eaten, throat torn open, body intact. Then another, then a third, this one partially dismembered, legs separated from the body and arranged in a line on the forest floor. Not eaten, displayed. I stood over that third kill in the gray light of a January morning and felt something I had not felt in years. Fear. Not fear of the unknown, fear of the known. Fear of Samael, who I had watched for 5 years, who I had fed, who I had named, and who was now killing for reasons that had nothing to do with hunger. I told myself it was territorial behavior. I told myself it was related to the sounds I had heard at the forest's edge. Perhaps other creatures encroaching on the territory, triggering a defensive response. I convinced myself that this was natural. I convinced myself that it would pass. That was my 3rd year of telling myself things would pass, and I was getting very good at it. By the spring of 2002, Samael would not let me approach the den. It would appear the moment I entered the ravine, rising from concealment with that terrible, fluid grace, and it would stand in my path, fully upright, chest expanded, producing a vocalization I had never heard before, a low, sustained rumble that I could feel in the ground through my boots. Not a growl, a warning, a wall of sound that said, "You do not belong here." I would stop, I would wait. Sometimes Ezra would appear behind Samael and produce its 3-syllable greeting, and Samael would turn on Ezra with a speed that left me breathless, and there would be a confrontation, snarling, posturing. One terrible night, a brief grappling that left Ezra with a gash across its shoulder that I could see, even in the dark, black blood matting the golden fur. After these confrontations, Samael would withdraw and Ezra would approach me, but the encounters were shorter now. Tenser, colored by the knowledge that we were operating on borrowed time. In the winter of 2000, I almost lost Ezra to something I hadn't anticipated. Illness. I arrived at the ravine on a night in late January to find Ezra lying in the den, breathing rapidly, its coat dull and matted with a discharge I hadn't seen before. It didn't rise when I approached. It didn't produce the greeting. It just lay there, watching me with those amber eyes, and I could see in them something I recognized from my years responding to accident scenes, the look of a living thing that knows it is in trouble and cannot help itself. I did the only thing I could think of. I drove to the Tractor Supply in Cadillac at 6 in the morning when the doors opened, and I bought veterinary antibiotics, amoxicillin suspension meant for cattle, dosed by weight. I had no idea if it would work on whatever Ezra was. I had no idea if the dosage was right. I calculated based on Ezra's estimated body weight of 250 and the instructions on the bottle, and I mixed it into raw ground beef and brought it to the ravine that night. Ezra ate it. Slowly, without enthusiasm, but it ate. I did this every night for 12 days. On the 8th day, Samael did something remarkable. It appeared at the den entrance carrying a bundle of plants in its mouth, long-stemmed, with small white flowers that I later identified as yarrow. It dropped them near Ezra and then withdrew. Yarrow, a plant that has been used in folk medicine for centuries as an anti-inflammatory and fever reducer. I am not saying Samael understood pharmacology. I am saying that something in its behavior, whether instinct or knowledge passed between generations, told it to bring that specific plant to a sick member of its group. I added yarrow to the logbook with a hand that was not entirely steady. Ezra recovered. By the 14th day it was moving again, and by the 20th it was back to its routines, the stone arrangements, the parallel walks through the forest, the 3-syllable greeting that hit me like a warm current every time I heard it. But the illness changed my understanding of what I was doing. I was not just an observer anymore. I was a caregiver. I was part of an ecosystem that included these creatures, and they had, in their way, included me back. Samael bringing the yarrow was not random. It was a response to crisis that acknowledged all members of the group, including, by proximity and routine, me. That same winter I discovered something about their sleeping patterns that fascinated me. They didn't sleep the way canids sleep. Canids doze, light, intermittent, always half alert. Ezra and Samael slept deeply, in cycles of approximately 4 hours, and during those deep sleep periods, Ezra would vocalize. Soft, rhythmic sounds that varied in pitch and tempo, sometimes speeding up, sometimes stopping abruptly before resuming in a different key. It was dreaming. I am as certain of that as I am of anything in my life. Ezra dreamed, and the dreams produced sounds, and the sounds had the same emotional range as its waking vocalizations. There were nights I sat outside the den and listened to Ezra dream, and felt like I was eavesdropping on a private language, a conversation between a mind and itself that I had no right to hear, but couldn't bring myself to leave. The spring of 2001 brought new behaviors. Ezra began bringing me things. Not food, objects. A feather from a great blue heron placed on the flat rock where I left meat. A perfectly round river stone, smooth and white, left on the path I used to enter the ravine. A piece of birch bark curled into a cylinder, placed precisely on the log where I usually sat. Each one was left in a location that was specifically associated with me, my path, my seat, my offering stone. These were not random, they were gifts, they were reciprocity. I had been bringing food for years, and Ezra was answering with the currency of its own world, objects it found beautiful. I kept every one. They're in a box under my bed. Sometimes I take them out and arrange them the way Ezra arranged its collection, in a line, by size, with the heron feather at the end like a punctuation mark. It helps me remember that it was real, that I didn't invent it, that there was a creature in this world that thought I was worth the effort of finding a perfect stone and carrying it a quarter mile through the dark to leave it where I would find it. I started bringing medical supplies, antibiotic ointment, gauze, tape. The absurdity of trying to apply first aid to a 250-pound cryptid canine in the dark was not lost on me, but Ezra allowed it. It would sit still, breathing that deep, furnace-hot breath, while I cleaned the wounds that Samael had inflicted. I talked to it while I worked. I said things like, "We can't keep doing this and I don't know how to fix this." Ezra would watch my face while I spoke with those amber eyes, intelligent, patient, understanding more than it should have been able to understand. In June of 2002, two things happened in the same week that made the ending inevitable. The first, I found tracks near my cabin. Not Ezra's, Samael's. It had followed me home. The tracks circled my property in a wide loop, pausing at several points where the approach to the cabin was clearest. It had surveilled me. It had studied the place where I slept. The distance I had maintained between my life and theirs, 6 miles of dense forest, meant nothing to something that could cover that ground in minutes. The second, I was in the ravine on a Wednesday night in late June when I heard the other sound again. The deep vocalization from the forest's edge, the one I had heard 7 times over the previous years, but this time it was closer, much closer. And this time, Samael answered it. I had never heard Samael produce the sound that came out of it that night. It was massive. It rolled through the ravine like a physical force, shaking the surface of the creek water, vibrating in my ribs. It was not a howl. It was not a roar. It was a declaration, a broadcast to something in the larger darkness that said, "I am here. This is mine." And the answer came back from the forest, from multiple directions, overlapping, a chorus of sounds that I could not count, but that I estimated at a minimum of 4 distinct voices. Ezra pressed itself against the wall of the den and made no sound at all. There were others. There had always been others, and they were closing in. The night it all ended was September 7th, 2002. I remember the date the way you remember the date someone dies. Temperature was 58 degrees. Wind from the northwest at maybe 5 miles an hour. New moon. The kind of darkness that exists only in places where the nearest electric light is miles away, where the forest canopy blocks even the stars. I had almost stayed home. Samael's behavior in the preceding weeks had been escalating. The tracks around my cabin were now a nightly occurrence, and twice I had heard vocalizations from the tree line at the edge of my property in the early morning hours. But Ezra was the pull. I hadn't seen Ezra in 9 days, the longest absence since our relationship began, and the absence was an ache in my chest that I could not ignore. I told myself I would go to the ravine, confirm that Ezra was alive, and leave. 30 minutes. In and out. I parked at the trailhead at 10:15 p.m. and began the 2-mile walk in. I was carrying a flashlight, which I never used, and a hunting knife on my belt, which I'd started carrying after finding Samael's tracks at my cabin. No gun. Even then, even with everything I knew, I could not bring myself to carry a gun to the ravine. Because to carry a gun meant to accept that I might need to use it, and to use it meant to destroy something I had spent 6 years building. I was an idiot. I know that now. I knew it then too, somewhere under the rationalizations, in the part of my brain that still thought like a trooper instead of a lonely old man who had made pets of something that was never meant to be kept. I reached the ravine at approximately 10:50 p.m. The silence hit me first. Not the normal silence of the nighttime forest. This was the absence of everything. No insects, no frogs, no owls, no wind in the canopy. The kind of silence that has weight, the kind that presses on your eardrums like a hand. The den was empty. The flat rock where I left food was overturned. Ezra's collection, the stones, the glass, the hubcap, was scattered. Not carelessly, not by weather, scattered the way things are scattered in a fight. I knelt by the creek bed and found blood on the stones. A lot of blood. Enough that the water running over the rocks carried a faint pink tint in my flashlight beam, and I had switched on the flashlight without thinking, which tells you exactly how scared I was. I called out, I know. But I called out, I said Ezra's name, the name I had given it, and the sound of my own voice in that silence was so small, so human, so inadequate against the scale of what was happening in those woods that I almost laughed. Then I heard it, from the south, from the direction of the highway, a sound I had heard 1,000 times in 6 years, but never like this. Ezra's 3-syllable vocalization, the one that was only for me. But it was wrong. It was stretched, distorted, filled with a quality I can only describe as anguish. It was the sound of something calling for help. I ran. A 62-year-old man with a bad knee and a flashlight, running through dense forest in total darkness toward the sound of a cryptid in distress. I fell twice. I cut my hands on something. I lost the flashlight and didn't stop to find it. I followed the sound. I found Ezra on the shoulder of State Route 132 at mile marker 28, the exact center of the corridor where this had all begun. It was lying on its side in the gravel, and in the faint light from a distant cell tower, I could see the damage. Deep wounds across the torso and shoulders, 4 parallel gashes on the left flank, each one at least 18 inches long, exposing muscle and in one place what I believe was rib bone. One ear torn nearly off, hanging by a strip of cartilage. The golden fur matted black with blood, so much blood that the gravel beneath it had turned to dark mud. It was breathing in short, wet, labored gasps that I recognized from my years as a trooper as the sound of a punctured lung. There were tracks around it, Samael's tracks, and others, the larger prints, the 19-inch ones I had cataloged and tried not to think about. There had been a fight, not between 2 creatures but between several. The gravel shoulder was torn up for 30 yards in both directions, and there were impact marks on the guardrail, dents that looked like they had been made by something slamming into the steel at tremendous force. Whatever had happened, it had been violent, and it had been prolonged, and Ezra had been in the middle of it. I dropped to my knees beside it. I put my hands on its shoulder and felt the heat, still burning hot, but wrong now, the heat of a body fighting to survive. Its eyes found mine, those amber eyes, the ones that had watched me with such patience, such intelligence, for 6 years. They found mine, and they held. Ezra made a sound. Not the 3-syllable greeting, not the murmur, not the singing. A single sound, clear and deliberate, pushed through a throat full of blood. A single syllable. Dale. I heard it. I am telling you that I heard it. 1 syllable, shaped around a damaged throat, but unmistakable. My name. The name I had spoken 1,000 times in the ravine, to the trees, to the creek, to this creature who I had told myself could not understand, could not learn, could not feel what I felt. Dale. I stayed with it. I sat on the gravel shoulder of State Route 132, and I held its head in my lap, and I felt its breathing slow, and then stop. It took 19 minutes. I counted every one. When it was over, I stayed. I stayed until the sky began to lighten, and I could see the full extent of the wounds, and I could see that they were not from a car, not from a trap, not from anything human. They were from claws, from jaws, from something that had attacked with the same precision that Samael brought to everything it did. I carried Ezra into the forest. It took me 3 hours to move the body a 1/4 mile, and I have never experienced physical effort like that before or since. 250 pounds of dead weight, carried and dragged through underbrush and over fallen logs by a man with a bad knee and a broken heart. I stopped 7 times. Each time I stopped, I sat next to the body and I talked to it, the way I had talked to Ezra when it was alive. I told it I was sorry. I told it I should have brought the gun. I told it I should have stayed home. I told it things that made no sense. Plans for next winter, feeding schedules, improvements I wanted to make to the den. I talked to a dead body in the forest like it could still hear me, because stopping the conversation meant admitting it was the last one. I dug the grave with my hands and a flat stone. The ground in the ravine is soft from centuries of creek sediment, and I dug down about 3 feet, not deep enough by any standard, but as deep as my body would allow. I buried it near the den, near the creek where the stones with their deliberate scratches still sat. I buried it with the smooth stones from its collection. I buried it with the amber glass and the green glass and the blue glass. I kept the hubcap. I don't know why. It's in my garage. I look at it sometimes and I can still see the morning Ezra carried it out of the forest and placed it in the center of its stone line with a precision that was almost ceremonial. Samael was gone. The den was abandoned. The tracks around my cabin stopped appearing. The sightings on 132 continued, not from me, but from other drivers, other travelers, the occasional report filtering through to police dispatch and being filed away as I had filed away that first report in 1992. Something was still out there. Something was always still out there. In the months after, I fell apart in the way that people fall apart when they lose something they can't explain to anyone. I stopped maintaining the cabin. I stopped eating regular meals. I stopped keeping the logbook because there was nothing left to log, and because the sight of my own handwriting, all those careful entries, all that evidence of years I could never get back, made me physically sick. I drove 132 at night, back and forth, mile marker 24 to 31, with my windows down, listening. I never heard the 3-syllable greeting again. I never heard singing in the rain. What I did hear, on a night in December of 2002, was Samael. It was standing at the tree line near mile marker 28. Full upright, 7 feet and change, silver-gray saddle catching the pale light of a half-moon. It was watching me the way it had always watched me, that flat, measuring stare. But something was different. It was standing at the exact spot where Ezra had died. And as I slowed my car and pulled to the shoulder, it did something it had never done in all the years I had known it. It vocalized at me, a single, sustained note, low and resonant, that went on for what felt like minutes but was probably 15 seconds. It was not a warning. It was not a threat. I have listened to that sound in my memory every day for 20 years, and the closest I can come to describing what it communicated is recognition, acknowledgement, something between an apology and a farewell. Then it dropped to all fours and disappeared into the forest. I never saw Samael again. But the story doesn't end there. Not cleanly, not the way stories are supposed to end. In the spring of 2003, 3 months after the last Samael sighting, something happened that I have never been able to explain, and that I have turned over in my mind every single day since. I was in the ravine, sitting by the grave. It was a warm night for April, and I had fallen into a half-sleep, the way I often did there, not fully unconscious, but drifting in that state between waking and dreaming where the forest sounds become a kind of music. I heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, close. I opened my eyes and saw nothing, but the footsteps continued, circling me at a distance of maybe 15 feet. I could hear the weight of whatever was moving. I could hear the soft compression of leaf litter under something massive, but I could see nothing. The moonlight was strong enough to illuminate the ravine floor, and there was nothing there. The circling continued for what I estimate was 5 minutes. Then it stopped, directly in front of me, and I felt breath on my face. Hot breath. The furnace heat breath I had felt 1,000 times sitting beside Ezra. But there was nothing there. I reached out my hand, and I swear on everything I have left in this world, my fingers touched fur. Warm, coarse, real fur, attached to a body I could not see. I touched it for maybe 2 seconds before it pulled away and the footsteps receded into the forest, and the normal sounds of the night returned. I don't know what that was. I don't know if it was Ezra. I don't know if Ezra survived and healed and came back, or if something else entirely was testing me, or if I was losing my mind in the slow, quiet way that grief sometimes takes people. I don't know, but I felt it, and the fur was golden. I couldn't see it, but I felt the texture, and it was the same coarse outer coat with the softer underlayer that I had felt when I held Ezra's head on the highway shoulder while it died. The same. I went back every night for a month. It never happened again. There were other things in those years after, things that kept me tethered to the ravine and to 132. In 2004, a family from Ohio called the sheriff's office to report that something had circled their campsite at the Hodenpill Dam recreation area for 3 hours in the middle of the night. They described sounds, the deep, resonant vocalization I knew as Samael's. They described a smell like copper and wet earth. They described their dog, a German shepherd, lying flat on the ground and refusing to move for the entire duration. The report was filed and forgotten. I found it 6 months later through a contact I still had at the department. I added it to the logbook. In 2005, a logging crew working a parcel 2 miles north of the ravine found a structure in a dense stand of white cedar. Logs stripped of bark, arranged in a lean-to configuration, floor packed with dried grass. They reported it to the DNR as a possible illegal camp. The DNR investigated and found no evidence of human habitation. No fire ring, no trash, no tool marks consistent with saws or axes. The bark had been stripped by hand, or by something with hands. In 2007, I found the scratch stone again. Not the original, a new one. In a creek bed 3 miles south of the ravine, on a flat stone partially submerged in the current. The same pattern, 3 vertical lines crossed by a diagonal, repeated. But this time, there were additional marks, circles, or attempts at circles, and what I can only describe as a horizontal line with smaller lines branching off it at regular intervals. Like a tree, or like a river system, or like something I am not equipped to interpret because I do not speak the language. I photographed it. The photograph is in the logbook. It is the clearest piece of evidence I have that these creatures possess not just intelligence but symbolic thought, the ability to create representations of things that are not physically present. A map, a diagram, a message. To whom, I don't know. About what, I don't know. But it was there, scratched into stone in a creek bed in Wexford County, Michigan. And it was not made by any human hand. People ask me, the few people I have told fragments of this story, whether I believe they are supernatural, whether they are demons or aliens or government experiments. I don't know what they are. I have 11 years of observations, 2,109 sightings, and a logbook full of measurements and descriptions, and I am no closer to an answer than I was the night Linda Hargrove called in to report a large dog walking on its hind legs. What I know is this. They are intelligent. They are emotional. They form bonds. They experience jealousy and tenderness and rage and loss. They have culture, collections, structures, vocalizations complex enough to convey meaning across individuals. They have been here longer than we have been paying attention, and they will be here after we stop. And I know one more thing, which is the reason for the title of this confession, and the reason I have never been able to fully return to the world of people and paychecks and normal Saturdays. When I say I became one of them, I don't mean I sprouted fur and fangs. I mean something quieter and in many ways worse. I mean that over 11 years, the boundary between my world and theirs eroded until there was no boundary at all. I mean that I learned to move through the forest in darkness without sound, the way they moved. I learned to read the wind and the silence and the absence of bird call as a language, the way they read it. I learned to sit for hours in perfect stillness, watching, waiting, existing in a state of awareness that has no use in the human world. I learned to love something that could not love me back in any way my species would recognize, and that love changed the shape of my brain. It rewired the circuitry. It replaced the parts of me that understood how to be a person with parts that understood how to be a presence in the forest. I go back to the ravine. I still go. The den collapsed years ago, and the creek has shifted course, and the flat rock is buried under silt. But I go. I sit where I sat with Ezra. I sit in the dark and I listen. Sometimes I hear things, distant vocalizations, the crack of a branch under enormous weight, a silence that is too complete to be accidental. Sometimes I hear nothing. But I go because the forest is the only place that feels real anymore. Because the cabin feels like a costume. Because the truck, the grocery store, the bank, the gas station, all of it feels like a performance I am putting on for an audience that doesn't exist. I am 67 years old. I have been carrying this for most of my adult life. The logbook is in the drawer. The hubcap is in the garage. The grave is in the ravine. I am the only evidence that any of this happened, and I am not going to be evidence for much longer. Not because I'm dying, although the doctor in Cadillac has said things about my heart that suggest the timeline is shorter than I'd like, but because I can feel the last threads of the person I used to be fraying away. The trooper, the veteran, the ex-husband, Dale Kowalski. These are labels for something that doesn't quite exist anymore. What exists is the thing that sits in the dark and listens, the thing that knows the forest, the thing that still, on some nights, produces a 3-syllable sound under its breath without meaning to, a sound that no one else would recognize, a sound that means, I am here, I am still here. They say you become what you love. They say it like it's a greeting card sentiment, something to put on a coffee mug. But I am telling you it is literal. I loved them. I loved the ravine and the den and the golden fur in the moonlight and the sound of breathing like a furnace and the amber eyes that held my gaze and understood. I loved the years, even the terrible ones, even Samael, even the blood on the gravel. I loved all of it because it was real and because the rest of my life was just waiting. And now I am something that sits between two worlds, belonging to neither. Not a trooper, not a dogman. Something in between that has no name, and no logbook entry and no mile marker. Something that walks the highway at night and knows what's in the trees, and can never tell anyone in a way that would make them understand. Until now. Until you. So there it is. 11 years, 2,109 sightings. 2 creatures named after angels. 1 grave in a ravine, and 1 old man who went looking for monsters and found out the monster was loneliness, and the cure was worse than the disease, and the cure's name was Ezra. And Ezra is gone, and the forest is still there, and I am still here. I am still here.